Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Yao Purby, and you will quickly hear how he is passionate about ministry to international students. Yao is a Ghanaian Canadian who is a physician, a pastor, president of International Student Ministries Canada. He's a teacher and speaker and an author. I do not know when he sleeps, actually. But he and his wife, Agnelé, live in Montreal, Quebec, and have 6 children. Dr. Purby, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Max. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here.
Well, just before we started recording, we were talking about the weather because Yao is Ghanaian, but now lives in Montreal, and we're in no rush to get to winter and snow, right?
Not at all.
Well, begin with that, please. How did you end up living in Canada?
It's a good question. Well, thank you for having me here at this time. Well, I was born and raised in Ghana, like you mentioned. My parents both came to faith in Jesus through the Ministry of Scripture Union, and so we were raised in a Christian home. But around 10 years of age, I made a conscious decision to give my life to Jesus. So born and raised in Ghana, life was great. I became a World Vision Youth Ambassador at about age 17 and had the opportunity to travel all the continents in the world except Australia. But somehow I always wanted to go back to Ghana. I had opportunity to study in the States, but always would go back to Ghana. I was so bent on staying in Ghana, making it big in Ghana, because I was kind of sick and tired of everybody thinking unless you went to America or England or Australia, somewhere in the West, you couldn't make it, economically speaking. So I was on the opposite path. Cut a long story short, I was sitting in a Lausanne Younger Leaders Gathering in Malaysia in 2006 when I heard the Lord speak so clearly to me. He said, "It's my world, and I send you where I want you." Okay. Yes, sir. And then 2 years later, 1.5 years later, in January 2008, my wife and I were reading the scriptures when Genesis 12:1 literally jumped off the pages. "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household and go to a land I will show you." We had no plans of leaving the country, but it was such a clear scripture. It erupted in our spirits. I remember telling my wife, "Honey, by the end of this year, we'll not be in Ghana." What I didn't know was where or how or when exactly, but it was so clear. By June, God had kicked me out of Ghana to Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. I was a medical doctor with the military, and Côte d'Ivoire was in civil war. So I was asked to join the United Nations peacekeeping troops there and be a doctor to the staff, UN staff, and the troops. So by June, I was out in Côte d'Ivoire. By July, he had kicked my wife Agnelé out of Ghana to Canada, to Montreal, to do her master's in economics at McGill. My wife is actually Canadian by birth. She was born in Hamilton. Yes, when her father was an international student doing his PhD at McMaster. So all of a sudden, we're scattered in 3 countries: Côte d'Ivoire, myself, Canada for my wife, and our little boy was in Ghana with my parents-in-law for about a year. So we ended up in 3 countries, and in Côte d'Ivoire, I got involved in a very tragic accident. There were 3 of us traveling in the car. The other 2 died. And I just knew the Lord had spared me for a purpose beyond medicine. And so I resigned from my hospital when I returned from Côte d'Ivoire. And around the same time, Agnelé, my wife, was transitioning from a master's to a PhD. And I was like, oh, Lord, a PhD take forever. So that's the human reason I moved to Canada with my son as missionaries, because I knew I wasn't coming to practice medicine after that accident. But the funny thing is that after we got here in Canada to join my wife, she got out of the PhD program. So she tricked me. No, I believe it was the Lord who used that to draw me into the country, and somehow he closed the PhD door. But he had already begun to use us significantly in the country, developing leaders, preaching itinerantly. And I got to pastor a Chinese church for about 4 years in Montreal. I always used to joke that only God can call an African to pastor an English-speaking Chinese church in a French city in North America.
Wow. What a journey.
It's a total God story. I couldn't have made it up.
Well, let's turn toward our topic here and ask about your experience, especially then working with international students.
International Students Ministry is a very personal thing to me because I have a family history of it. I just told you about my own parents-in-law who were studying in Canada. But my own grandfather, I mean, my family history, my grandfather was our first international student, 1944. He went to England on a steamboat. It took him 2 weeks to get to England from Ghana to be an international student. But since then, my mom has been an international student. I myself was an international student in Kentucky, for a short period during my high school days. So it's something very personal to us. So when my wife and I were living in Montreal, we had the opportunity to start ministering to students, anything ranging from airport pickups to inviting students over for Thanksgiving meals, Easter, Christmas. One of my favorite things is just discipling and developing them as leaders. And I think of someone like Manuel, who came from Mexico, and we had the opportunity to disciple him and develop him as a leader. He went back to Mexico and started really impacting his context. He had gone back and was making such an impact in the workplace. In the end, he led his boss to Jesus, to a personal relationship with Jesus. And a couple of years ago, I had the chance to visit Manuel in Mexico. Not only had Manuel led the boss to Jesus, the boss had led her mother to Jesus too, and now growing her son in the ways of God. So grandmother, mother, son. Like I came back from Mexico thinking, wow, this ministry to internationals is not just international, it's also intergenerational. So I could tell you many stories about my involvement personally and our family's involvement with international students. But about 6 years ago, I was invited by International Student Ministries Canada, ISMC, to be the president of this organization, which you introduced at the beginning.
Wow. Well, I just see how it flowed very naturally out of your personal relationships. And like you said, it wasn't just about the international students, but it led to increasing fruit through them.
That's right.
This is a great vision, and I look forward to getting into this with you a little bit. As we consider global missions, why should international students capture our attention? You've shared a little bit about this, but why do you think this is important to a church?
This is important and should get our attention because God is on the move. I say God is on the move. We know God has always been on the move, even before Genesis 1. But there are more people on the move on earth than ever before in the history of the world. 250 million people on the move. We technically we call them diaspora. Diaspora means scattered people. And of these 250 million people crossing international boundaries, they include refugees, temporary foreign workers, and all these. But of these, 5 million of them are international students. These are people studying in a country other than the ones they are citizens of. And when people move, it's actually God on the move because it is God who moves people. Paul speaking at the Areopagus made that very clear in Acts 17, that it is God who determines our histories and our geographies. And so if there are 5 million plus international students on the move in the world, then for me, what it means is that, wow, God is really on the move. Because when people move, the gospel moves. And you see that throughout the book of Acts as well. Either God moves people to spread his fame, or he moves people to get to know his name. So you look at the Ethiopian eunuch, right? He goes to Jerusalem and it's on his way back. God moves him, and at the same time, God moves Philip, to encounter him while he's reading, Isaiah 53, and he has no clue what this is talking about. So you see how God moves people both to spread his fame and to get to know his name. And Paul says it beautifully in Acts 17 when he's preaching at the Areopagus, and he says, it is God who determines our times, and the exact locations. And he says that God does this so that people will seek him and perhaps reach out to him and find him. This should get our attention because God is on the move. Again, I think it's important to realize that when we talk about missions, a lot of times people just think, oh, go, missions, let's go. And there is an aspect of going. But throughout scripture, there's also an aspect of the nations coming. So it's going to the nations, which, some missiologists call the centrifugal force, like in physics, the force going out of the center, like go and be a blessing to the nations. But there's also what is called the centripetal force, which is come to the blessing. So you see, for example, and it's right from the Old Testament, right from, Genesis, Adam and Eve leaving the garden, in Genesis 3, in the great scattering in Genesis 11, all of that throughout the scriptures, even for Israel. Think about Ruth, the story of Ruth. Naomi goes, right? Centrifugal, goes to the nations, goes, to Moab. But guess what? Ruth comes to the blessing. She leaves and says to Naomi, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, and so she comes, centripetal to the blessing, to Israel. So it's both ways, going and coming.
Yeah, I hear you saying going and coming, both. I also hear you really emphasizing the sovereignty of God in this, that He is the mover. And
Absolutely.
so there's this mix of God's moving and our readiness to engage in what He is doing. You sometimes talk about the 4 S's. Would you talk with us about the 4 S's here?
All right. Yes, because sometimes when people ask, why is this important to engage the international student ministry, I say, well, for these 4 reasons, 4 S's. Number one, because it's a statistically sensible thing to do. Canada has 600,000 international students. I mean, that's more than PEI. That's more than, and that's a whole province on its own. Just the Greater Toronto area alone has 150,000 of them. The United States has 1.2 million international students. That's double what we have. But considering that there are 300 million people, to just 35 million people in Canada, that makes it very significant for Canada per capita. All right. So it's a statistically sensible thing to do. But number 2, it's a scripturally sound thing to do. And we've been discussing a bit of that from Genesis through the Old Testament, all through the book of Acts. Of course, Jesus said, go to the nations. Guess what? The nations have come to us. So it's a scripturally sound thing to do. Don't forget, Leviticus 19 says, love the stranger as yourself. I don't hear that quoted a lot. We have a responsibility there to love the foreigner as ourselves. So it's a scripturally sound thing to do. Number 3, it's a stunningly simple thing to do. I mean, all of a sudden, no passports, no visas, and you're a missionary? Like, when did that happen? They actually come into your home. You don't even need to learn a foreign language. A lot of times they actually want you to teach them English, or teach them French. Wow. It's a stunningly simple thing to do. And then 4thly, this is a strategically smart thing. Only God could have thought of this, Max. I mean, I think about the strategic people that these are. These are the brightest and the best from around the world. And they are right in our neighborhoods, right in our communities. These are young people, full of energy, mobile people. So they're strategic people, but also it's a strategically smart thing because they come from strategic locations in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Many people have heard of what is called the 1040 window. It's the area between latitude 10 degrees north and 40 degrees north. It has 2/3 of the world's population. It's the most difficult places to reach in the world because it has China, India, the Middle East. Guess what? About 70% of the international students in Canada, in the US, come from the 1040 window. I mean, is that an accident? I mean, 25% of our students in Canada come from China. 30% come from India. Actually, this is the first year India has overtaken China in Canada. 2% of them come from Saudi Arabia and Iran. So think about it. The countries most difficult to reach with the gospel are the countries that are sending the most students to Canada. It's a strategically smart thing for this to get our attention.
Well, I think it's great. 4 S's, I might call it 8 S's. I can hear your pastoral side coming out.
That's true.
But it is, I'll use another S. It's striking,
That's right.
all of these things, the numbers. And very often we are talking about the mission field coming to us. We've talked through the paradigm of going, and I think I still want to emphasize we still need to go.
Absolutely.
And yet there is this tremendous opportunity before us, as you said, right in our neighborhoods, right in our own cities. Yeah, I wonder whether there's a particular story that you might share with us to illustrate just what a blessing this ministry can be.
Absolutely. As you can tell, I have a ton of them, but I'll give you one. probably your listeners know that Japan is still about 1% Christian. That's heartbreaking, but that is a reality. But the interesting thing is, just like Paul says in Acts 17, it's my Japanese friends say that they've noticed that their fellow Japanese are about 20 times more likely to come to faith in Jesus outside of Japan than in Japan. And that was the story of Kenji, who came to study at the University of Calgary. Kenji did not like Christians. He came from a Buddhist background, but God began to change all of that. And through the hospitality of the Christian community and our staff at ISMC and all of that, in the end, Kenji gives his heart to Jesus. Now, this is my favorite part. Kenji goes back to Japan and leads his father, who is a Buddhist monk, a Buddhist deacon, to faith in Jesus. That's so radical in this man's transformation that he asked that the shrine, there was an Inari shrine in the house, he asked that they get rid of the shrine. In fact, he asked that his name be even removed from the ancestral roll. Wow. Now, Kenji tells me that this was so drastic because his father, together with the Buddhist monk who did the ceremony to remove some sacred stones, are direct descendants of the samurai who came to start their village in the 1500s. So see how God changes 500 years of history by a student who thinks he's coming to get a degree from Canada, but really the sovereign God who moves people and nations has something else in mind.
Yeah, a lot of our listeners are in local churches. They may be attending a local church, worshiping there, or they may actually be a pastor or leading the church. What are some opportunities for local churches to minister to international students?
The opportunities are tons and tons and tons of them. Don't forget that in the first place, a lot of these students come and they are lonely. They're looking for community. So the local church has a great opportunity in hosting these students, whether it's for regular weekly meals or it's for occasional meals. The other thing is another big need of a lot of them, not everyone, but a lot of them is language study. So churches that have things like ESL for the community can have these students come in and practice or be conversation partners. Last week, there was a church that opened up to do a barbecue, for the community. And all these students came in, and most of them were from Iran. And now, because of that, they've gotten people in the congregation to be conversation partners, just to help people improve their English and their confidence. But at the same time, the church gets into the community. So the opportunities are, I'll put them this way: they're campus opportunities, they are community opportunities, because you can help them find places to shop. In fact, I have some staff in Fredericton who once a week actually do a shopping run, a grocery run. Yeah, because the campus at UNB, University of New Brunswick, is far from town where they can get to shop. So church members come with their cars, and give anybody who is willing ready for a ride all the way. They drop them there and they do their shopping. They bring them back to campus.
Nice.
So there are campus opportunities, there are community opportunities, including taking on hikes and helping them understand Canadian history and relating Canadian history to the gospel. There are opportunities to invite them to church when the Lord opens that door. Over the Easter period, just this Easter, some students went to a home in Waterloo. This woman just hosted 7 students in her home, and one of the students from China just said, this is this story of Easter. Can I go to church with you on Sunday? She said, of course. So she gave her a ride to church, and the lady goes to church and just gives her life to Christ that day.
Wow.
I'm talking about Easter 2019. All right. So there are all these opportunities. But there's also opportunities overseas, because after they go back, you can follow up, conversations. You can go and visit. A lot of people have had the opportunity to visit India, or in Indonesia or whatever it is, because of these friendships that they've made with these students. And there's even opportunity for church planting overseas for churches. I will get into some of the practical things shortly as we go on in the conversation.
Yeah, I just want to note together with you, though, a lot of the things you have mentioned are very accessible to anyone in the church. You mentioned the conversation partners. Just pick on that one.
That's right.
This is not necessarily someone who has extensive ESL training, English as a second language training.
Not all.
because we speak English comfortably, that makes it a possibility, even an attractive option, just to spend time together. Giving someone a ride to the store and helping them shop at Safeway or Food Basics or whatever the store is. These are simple
Mhm.
things that just about anyone can do, right? You don't need deep theological training to do this.
At all, which is what makes this stunningly simple. That all of a sudden, with very little experience or training or theological background or whatever, all of a sudden we are missionaries to some of the most unreached people in the world. How does that happen?
Amazing.
Yes, I agree with you. In fact, I don't know how many people are familiar with Operation World. They publish these books that help us to pray. And Jason and Molly run Operation World right now. And we had a meeting of Lausanne leaders recently in Wheaton, and they were sharing that, according to their research, 80% of the world's Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims do not personally know a Christian. And see, God brings those people into a context that all of a sudden they can meet a whole bunch of Christ followers. But the sad reality is that in some contexts, not every context, but in some contexts, some have reported that as high as about 80% of these international students can study for 4 years in Canada or the United States and never get to enter a Canadian or American home.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? Wow.
Wow, not even a church, a home. So that's an indictment on us, that God will bring the people who have no contact with the gospel or people of the gospel right into our communities, and they end up going back home without that contact.
On that note, then, if we agree that some of us would like to help change this reality that students have not been ministered to, what are some of the practical suggestions you have for us?
At International Student Ministries Canada, we like to say that our mission, which is really the mission of the whole church, is empowering international students to impact the world through Jesus Christ. Because it's not just about what we do for them, but what God does through them as well to impact the world. So a simple way to remember what empowering them to impact the world through Jesus Christ is this. International Student Ministry helps, HELPS, is an acronym. So helps means providing hospitality and friendship. That's the H. All right. And so what are some of the practical hospitality and friendship things you can do? Many. We just talked about conversation partners. We can talk about a very simple one I want to give you, anybody can do, is there's something we call Friends for Dinner. Very simple. Just 3 times a year, or you can choose just once at Easter or Christmas or Thanksgiving. Just add an extra plate at your table. The E is edification and evangelism, or discipleship, and evangelism and discipleship. Now, I put edification or discipleship first because a lot of us tend to think linearly. You get saved and then you're discipled. But in international student ministry, a lot of times people get discipled and then they are saved. And I challenge people's perception of that, because I ask people, when did the disciples of Jesus actually get saved? But yeah, people are come for Bible studies, sermon discussions, things like that. You're discipling them along the way, and at some point they cross the line of faith. It could be here while they're in Canada or the US, or sometimes when they are back home. So any one of us can start a Bible study, 1-on-1 or 1-on-2 or 1-on-a-few. You can join a group if there's a ministry around, like ISMC or InterVarsity or Power to Change or Navigators or any of these groups, or if your own church has a ministry to internationals. You can join and disciple and evangelize these international students. So that's the E. The L is leadership development. We develop these students because these students invariably are going to lead their nations. I mean, there's a list of about 300, 400 international leaders in the world who were all international students just here in North America. These students are going to lead. The question is, are they going to lead in the way of Jesus? Are they going to lead in a way that makes a difference in the world for the mission of God? So we take leadership development as an important part. And many of you work in the business world, you train leaders, you mentor people. Please, you could come alongside, and help. One of the major things we're looking at is mentoring people according to their skills. So if you're a doctor and there's an international student, doing medicine, you get to not only mentor them in the work that you do, but in their faith as well. And so there's leadership development. And then the P is we prepare them to head back home. That's important because there's reverse culture shock when people go back and things like that. We prepare them, then we partner with them. And the S is we send them. And I think that's an important thing for us to let them go as missionaries to their people.
Yeah, what are some of the things that can happen when international students return to their home countries after their time in, say, the United States or in Canada?
Well, a whole lot. Some of it good, some of it bad. Let me start with the bad. Sadly, we've noticed that a lot of students who come to faith in Jesus when they return, jettison their faith. And there are a number of reasons for this, which the time won't allow us to get into. But in some contexts, as high as 80% of people, leave the faith they found in the US or Canada due to persecution or work-related pressures, etc. But particularly, I'll ask our listeners to pray for China. China is increasingly putting a squeeze around people who return as Christians. But there's also the good that happens, like we also see many people go back as salt and light and begin to affect their nations. One of my favorite is a guy who went back many years ago, Bhag Singh from northern India, the Punjabi region, came to know Christ at the University of Manitoba and went back to start an indigenous church planting movement that up to now has planted about 10,000 churches. So only God knows. In Africa, we have a saying that the one who beats the drum cannot tell how far the sound goes.
Wow.
May we beat the drum well in Canada, and only eternity will reveal how far the sound went.
Yeah. Well, I think that we know the answer to this already, but I'm going to tuck it in here before our break. We're talking about ministering to students, but do you need to be a young person in order to minister to international students?
Not at all, which is the great news. Because a lot of our staff are actually returnee missionaries, which is a cool thing. But a lot of our volunteers, we have about 500 volunteers around the world. A lot of them do this actually post-retirement because they're looking for things to do. Recently, there's a ministry that paired actually lonely seniors with lonely students. How cool is that? Because it's interesting, those two demographics tend to be very lonely. So absolutely not. You don't need to be a young person. In fact, being relatively older is hugely advantageous in the work of international student ministry because a lot of these students come from home cultures that have profound respect for the aged. If you're aged, you are wise, you are dignified. I know we live in a culture in North America that's very youth-centric, but these people are coming from places where if you are older, it's actually an advantage, And don't forget, it's also a great opportunity to have intergenerational ministry because some students come as scholars, postdocs and things like that, and they come with their children, So it's actually a ministry that a whole family, grandparents and parents and children can be involved, in their home or in the community or in the church. So you don't have to be a young person to enter the ministry to international students.
In just a moment, you can hear Yao is uniquely prepared for this conversation and enthusiastic about it. In a couple of minutes, I'm just going to ask you to share some of the ways Christ followers can be equipped to minister to international students. But just before we get to that part of the conversation, we'd like to share this missions resource with you. We hope it will be helpful to you and your church.
Do you have your 15 Days of Prayer for the Hindu World booklet yet? Join with Christians from around the world in this focused time of prayer for our Hindu friends and neighbors. The 15 Days of Prayer begin on October 20th this year. To learn more, visit 15daysprayer.com. And now, back to today's conversation.
We're back with Dr. Yao Purby of International Student Ministries in Canada. Yao, if someone is sensing the Lord is leading them forward in this, they'd like to begin reaching out to international students, how do you recommend they get equipped for this ministry?
Well, first of all, pray. Prayer is foundational. Prayer will open doors. Prayer will open your heart. Prayer will open your eyes. Prayer will open the opportunities for you to have contact with people you could have never dreamt of. So prayer is the first thing. I actually encourage you to get together with somebody else and start a prayer circle and start praying about this thing that God is putting on your heart, and pray for the community, pray for international students, etc. Second is this importance of vision casting. So I really encourage you to, if possible, get somebody who's already involved, in this kind of ministry to have a conversation with. It could be an ISMC staff, it could be an InterVarsity or Power to Change staff and Navigator staff, somebody who's already doing this. It really helps to sharpen the vision and get our hearts burning. There are, of course, resources like books as well. I personally have a book called Thinking Outside the Window, and there are a couple of books out there that could help sharpen the vision. So prayer, then vision casting. The third is the actual training. The training would involve things like the theology of hospitality. That is key, Max. That is key. In fact, I really encourage our pastors to get into that. It's something that is kind of lost in our culture, but the theology of hospitality, training in cross-cultural communication, and sensitivity. So the bunch of training that can be done by our staff, who can come to your city and do that training. Or we actually have a number of trainings we have done online. We have tons of training, like 15-minute trainings, and you can take them one after the other, to inform you and form your heart and give you the skills as well to be able to do this. I will highly recommend a website for training called everyinternational.com, www.everyinternational.com, and you'd find a ton of videos that will help. How do you host a Muslim student? What is a shame honor culture? Little things we all should know. You'd find that we've intentionally gone through the basics and recorded these videos from people who are experts in international student ministry. Some have been doing this for 40 years of their lives, and recorded these there for your benefit. Get trained.
Wonderful. And we will include all of those resources in the show notes so that you can easily find those afterwards. Sometimes our churches, have missions committees. I'm wondering if, there's a group of people in a church that really want to get this going. What do you recommend as the first step they can take? You did mention pray, of course, but if you're speaking to that committee and they're agreed to pray, what's the first step they should take?
Yeah, so they agree to pray, and the next thing I say is look around you, see what God is doing right there in your community. Even as you pray, prayer walk your community, prayer walk the campuses in your community, and the Lord begins to open your eyes, to these various opportunities around you. We need every church to be able to run a church-based, international students ministry, just like you run women's ministry or men's ministry or children's ministry. Just contact us, and we are more than happy to share resources and train those churches to be able to get this going in their context.
Well, if you're thinking about this in your church, there's an invitation to have some folks that have deep experience help inform your journey and to be helpful along the way. In just a moment, I'm going to ask Yao to share his vision for international student ministry overall. But just before you do, Yao, what resources will you recommend? And we'll keep these in the show notes, resources that would be helpful for Christ followers and for churches who want to learn about this.
Excellent. Now, I want to highly recommend the Kairos course, which is a missions training course for any ordinary Christian. I highly recommend that because it will give you the head, the heart, and the hands for missions generally. But then an easy on-ramp is international student ministry, because you can reach Saudi Arabia or wherever, right, in your city and your campus. And so another resource is friendsfordinner.ca. And there, what happens is that you can, in 3 simple steps, you can sign up to host students during Christmas, Easter, or Thanksgiving, or, any special occasion, usually like that. And any students can go up there and say, I want to be hosted. And then our good folks all over the country kind of match students with with church people. We ask pastors to be your reference, so it's important that your local church pastor knows you and can vouch for you. So not all cities across Canada or the US have this, but if your city is not on there, let us know. And you are willing to quarterback that, wonderful. We'll get your city on there and we can go. We want to see every city, included in that. I already talked about www.everyinternational.com, where you can get all this training. But there's a new one that the Lausanne movement, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Lausanne, but it's something Billy Graham started in 1974. The Lausanne Global Classroom shot some short videos also that give the vision and the reason and some training in international student ministry. There are a ton of books you can look at as well. Like I said, there's Thinking Outside the Window is one that I wrote myself. You can find that on Amazon. There's Paradigm Shift, How International Students Are a Strategic Mission Opportunity, that was just released by Jack Burke, who used to work at University of Houston with international students. He's been part of ISM in North America for over 40 years, and a couple of others. But we'll put some of these on the show notes as well so that you can have them.
We will, together with Yao, make sure that list is on the show notes. Now, if anyone in our audience would like to reach out to you and to advance this conversation, follow up, or contact you, how can they do that, Yao?
The easiest way is info@ismc.ca.
Now, just as we close, I'm going to ask Yao to share just a bit about his vision, about the potential of this ministry. We've heard that all through this interview. Of course, Yao, it's clear that you have a passion for this. You have a vision for it. But here's an opportunity if you could just stand before the church. What's your vision for this?
My vision is that every international student in the US and Canada, that's 1.8 million of them, every international student from every nation will have the opportunity to encounter the gospel, and then they become a catalyst for an evangelical church for every people, Christ-like leaders for every church, and kingdom impact in every sphere of society. That's my heart. Every international.
Well, there's a grand vision. It is a God-sized vision. And that's where Yao is putting his faith and trust as he leads his team. I want to thank you again for spending this time with us to share this vision. May the Lord bless you as you continue forward.
Thank you so much, Mac.
I was really encouraged by this episode, and I think it is a doorway for many churches to consider how they can be cross-cultural without going anywhere. You may have students very near to you who would be blessed and encouraged and introduced to the gospel by lifting this idea of ministry to international students. We hope you found it helpful. This episode of the Global Missions Podcast has been brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the team, thank you for listening, and we invite you to join us in 2 weeks when we'll continue the conversation, exploring this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.